Hey, what's up, everybody? Shitty's on Broadway. So, wanted to come at you with a little bit of a unedited, unscripted Dice Throne video. Haven't made one of these in a while. Definitely still working on a few things in the pipeline, but kind of wanted to do something more unprompted, unscripted. I've been working on some scripts for a couple hours today and yesterday, and generally just wasn't having a great time with the grind of it all. And I feel like if you're just not enjoying, sorry, it's super hot in here because if I run my fan, you're gonna hear some bad background noise. So, but anyway, so I just want to run you guys through a tier list, just because I kind of wanted to do something more passionate, more fun. So I kind of have some like stats and stuff pulled up here, sources for like my data and whatnot. But some of these are going to be a little bit of bias tendencies showing when it comes to my actual placements of these heroes. So, what are we doing today? Well, I wanted to come at you guys with what I believe to be a pretty. You can't call it perfect because I think everybody that you ask is going to have slightly differing opinions. But what I believe to be a particular tier list that you guys can use when attempting to play Dice Throne competitively. Now, this is not to say I hate a specific hero. In fact, most of my favorite heroes are lower on this list, but this is just to give you more of an accurate demonstration of heroes where they belong in the current competitive meta. Now, in the next few months, when X-Men releases, I'm sure this is going to be something that is going to be changed, of course. So don't necessarily hold this tier list to 100% fact. Of course, bias again will come out occasionally as I talk about specific heroes, specific matchups. But I find that this tier list is going to be fairly accurate. You can slightly shift a hero or two to the left or to the right, but for the most part, I kind of listed them in left to right in what I believe to be strongest to weakest, of course, starting with S tier. But I do believe that each hero in the tier that I listed them on is correct, definitively. Regardless of who you kind of ask around, you can maybe make an argument to drop one or two. But the order of the heroes that these are put in kind of vary between competitive player to competitive player. So as far as who I've talked to, my experience with the game, I haven't played in too many competitive tournaments. I've played in a few online tournaments and then a couple in-person events. I've also held several in-person events, but these are more like casual things. But as far as my experience with the game, I've been playing Dice Throne since early 2020. I probably have hundreds and hundreds of games under my belt, just including the games that I've played on the Freehawks Discord alone. I probably have, if I had to give a rough estimate, maybe like 400 games, but in total, I'm thinking that number is probably closer to 1,000. I'm just kind of spitballing an estimate there, but I would say that I probably average a few games a week and have been doing that consistently for the last few years, just to give you like a general guideline of my experience with the game. But anyway, let's look at the tier list. Enough rambling. Sorry, it's been 3 minutes. I don't want to get this video to be too long, but we're going to try to keep the editing to a minimum. But I just want to keep this kind of entertaining and kind of fast paced for you guys, especially since it's unscripted. So I don't want to go too off topic or on a rant. Let's go ahead and start with S tier. So, Curse Pirate is definitively, in my opinion, the best character. And again, we're talking strictly 1v1 competitive Dice Throne. So, I would put Curse Pirate as the strongest character in Dice Throne. Actually, one more thing I want to note. We are going to be talking about the leaflet changes for the Spider-Man and Thor. So, this is going to be talking post-nerf Thor and post-buff Spider-Man, which are going to be coming official in a couple months with the X-Men Kickstarter. But these changes are going to be reflecting that because people are going to be asking, where's Thor on the top of the list? Thor is currently number one, undisputed, but when this leaflet comes out in a month or two as an official change, he is no longer in S tier, 75% win rate. But we'll come back to Thor as that comes up. But anyway, Curse Pirate. With the nerfs in mind, I do find that Curse Pirate is currently the best character in Dice Throne for 1v1. For a few reasons. Number one, she probably has, other than Shadow Thief, the best economy in the game. She consistently gets a ton of combat points just from her defense, from her cards, from her abilities alone. She outputs a significant amount of damage, and she really kind of has no drawback. She does have the curse to consider, but when you look at a Dice Throne hero generally, you're either good at damage, kind of more of a glass cannon build, you're more of a jack of all trades, or you're more economy based where you're focused on cards, combat points, kind of building an engine. Curse Pirate kind of takes that archetype and kind of throws it out the window because she produces an insane amount of card draw, an insane amount of combat point production. Her role objectives are quite easy, to be honest. There's not a lot of opportunity to whiff, and even if there is, your board baseline is incredibly easy to roll on. So even in like, so I would actually say, to reiterate, that some people would put Shadow Thief above Curse Pirate and Curse Pirate in 2. The reason I put Pirate at number 1 is that Pirate is incredibly easier to pilot over Shadow Thief, even in the hands of an inexperienced player. Curse Pirate is inherently less punishing for that reason. If you give Shadow Thief to a brand new player and say, good luck, have fun, you might as well throw him at the bottom of D or F tier. Like, this character is very hard to pilot as well. But Curse Pirate, again, generally, she doesn't have any upgrades, so you don't have to worry about starting your hand with, with garbage. And with the ability to draw so many cards, she kind of like outputs that into play, right? So she has cards that can steal CP. She has abilities that can make you discard cards. She has certain tokens and effects that are really hard to play around and maneuver around. Parlay, for instance, is one of the, I believe to be one of the strongest effects in the game. You just can't damage the Cursed Pirate at all. And not only that, to talk about her defense, rolling a 6 to dodge or to block 2 damage, excuse me, is absurd, right? Like it's 2 per symbol. So in my opinion, Pirate is going to be the top of S tier here. It's really hard to sway me of otherwise. I've seen her played in a lot of tournaments online, a lot of tournaments in person, and I think that that's pretty well established for her. But yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions on that. But moving on to Shadow Thief. Shadow Thief, again, ranked 1, ranked 2, depending on who you ask. Kind of the same reason as Curse Pirate, but a little bit different in the sense. Shadow Thief has probably one of the strongest defenses in the game, considering Cardicopia. There's like a little joke that runs that Shadow Thief actually doesn't like 6s, he likes 5s, because with Cardicopia, especially with the upgrade, you're just drawing so many cards and you're building your hand. The whole concept around the hero being that you spend the first few turns just gaining combat points and gaining cards, crafting the hand and using the cards as you need to, and then displaying all of that at once in the burst effect that you do damage per amount of CP that you have. So that, quick run of Shadow Thief. But of course, everybody hates him because he can stall. Cards like Enter the Shadows, where you just avoid all damage, enter the shadows immediately. It is very hard to play against a good Shadow Thief. The damage that they do is consistent. Generally, in most cases, you'll see like economy-based heroes kind of being pushed higher on tier lists in general and more in competitive play just because they're more safe, right? Shadow Thief has harder role objectives, but also produces an insane amount of combat points and cards while actually outputting a pretty decent amount of damage as well. Like his buildup is, of course, slower, but the reason, of course, Shadow Thief being so high is you have full control if you're patient enough in the way that you play the game. And to reiterate on a point I explained previously, I do think that Shadow Thief is very easy to screw up with. As somebody that, you pilot the hero, you can make a really bad play. You can use all of your cards to turn out into something that really wasn't what you intended to or what you needed to. It's not uncommon with Shadow Thief that you actually draw through your entire deck and redraw depending on the opponent that you play against. So for that particular reason, just the amount of, again, the control that you have with Shadow Thief is just what pushes him to the top of S tier here. Yeah, and of course with rolling defense, Shadow Defense, Counter Strike, Shadow Defense, of course, you can just modify your defense roll. You have cards like Better D, 6-It, Try Again, Same Z's. There's so many cards, so many opportunities that allow Shadow Thief escape routes or options to bypass damage, especially when a lot of these characters require tokens to attack mod or tokens to modify damage. And of course, that's not to say that Shadow Thief is unbeatable, but I find it to be quite difficult depending on the person that is piloting the hero, of course. They have to already be good at the game. Moving on to Pyromancer. Pyromancer I put at the bottom of S tier, but it's still top 3 and no matter who you ask, I would say top 5 characters in the game. Simply put, she's a glass cannon. Her role objectives are weird on paper, but actually really effective in practice. Combustion, the ability to just to a ton of undefendable damage. Now, she might be a glass cannon in the sense that she can't prevent any damage, so generally when you're attacking her, you don't really have too much of a risk outside of the fact that, just like every other hero, she might be holding dice mods. But with Pyromancer in particular, she swings back pretty hard on defense, especially if she gets that upgraded. But you do need to be careful of the fact that she outputs a ton of damage. Any ability that she upgrades, I find to be like overwhelming. Let me just pull up a quick picture of her hero board. There we go. I forgot the name. Burning Soul. So you go into Burning Soul, you're just computing a ton of fire mastery. Burn is a very nasty status effect. And of course, stun. With mini ult or her micro ult upgrade, as part of the mini ult, of course, the ability to inflict stun is absolutely devastating. So Pyromancer is just at the top here just because she outputs the most consistent and most powerful attacks out of the entire roster. Of course, having stun helps with that, but she's a lot less punishing than characters like Barbarian. Now, of course, you don't have any economy whatsoever, so completely different than these two. She has no ways to generate cards or combat points outside of her general income phase, and I think 1 or 2 cards in her unique deck. But not too much to say about Pyromancer. Pyroblast in general, especially if you get that upgrade, she just has so many safe abilities to roll into. Pyroblast is something you can actually spam. If you get that upgraded, you can roll Pyroblast every single turn, and you can probably beat half the heroes on this list just doing that. But Pyromancer, again, overall, everybody loves her. Everybody struggles to play against her. She is by far, again, one of the heaviest hitters on this list. Moving down to A tier, we have Monk. Monk can be argued anywhere from bottom of S tier to mid to low or high even A tier. This is a kind of like heavily debated hero amongst the competitive players. I put him at the top of A tier for a few reasons. When I think of a Dice Throne hero, I generally prefer to play economy-based heroes, but if I'm not playing an economy-based hero, something with cards, rerolls, CPs, whatever, Monk is kind of like a fail-safe because of kind of like the flexibility you have. So kind of like a jack of all, but I would actually argue he's a master in quite a few fields. Of course, Monk being able to block damage with Chi, incredibly strong defense. Meditate is arguably one of the better abilities to roll on any hero board. Again, like Chi is flexible. You either have a +5 attack mod or a -5. You can get Cleanse and Evasive, and depending on your matchup, Cleanse can actually be quite important. I find Monk to be just kind of a bit of a powerhouse. Tempest Rush, if you roll into that, especially with the upgrade, or if you hold like a Sixit or a Samesies in your hand, you can output 20 plus damage. Not consistently, but to give you a little bit of a funny story, of course I have to mention this story. I played a tournament game as the Monk against Artificer, and I won that game 50-0, unironically, using Monk's Tempest Rush 3 times. I won the game within, I think it was 5 turns, but it was 50-0. The Artificer couldn't even hit me. So power swing, power level-wise, Monk is incredibly strong. What kind of separates him from Pyromancer is I think you give up a little bit more consistent damage for a significant improvement to survivability. But as far as why he's placed lower than Pyromancer, just the burst potential with the play-by-plays. Because Monk has like a bit of a, you can play him as a bit of a turtle style where you're just gaining cheese, gaining evasives, not really going all out on defense. But the reason why Monk is considered less of a powerhouse compared to some of the other characters is you do have to spend a turn to build up that chi. So you're kind of spending every 2 turns to get that really big turn, whereas you might have 1 turn that's okay, average, medium damage. But overall, his unique cards are very strong as well. He is very starved for combat points, so you will have to, of course, sell things, just like the Pyromancer. He doesn't have a way to generate combat points. But just want to throw that out there that I think Monk is an incredibly strong hero. So moving on to Paladin, I put Paladin at high top at A tier. People disagree with that. But I find Paladin to be very strong. Again, he's one of those heroes you can play very poorly, very inconsistently if you're not doing what should be done with the hero. And what I mean by that is you don't have a base ability to fall back on, right? So when it comes to Paladin here, I have this hero board. When it comes to Paladin, you have things like Retaliate, Righteous Combat. You have your straights built up together. Now, whereas you do generate a lot of card and combat points, what the strength of Paladin really is, in my opinion, his tokens are some of the strongest in the game. His survivability is one of the strongest in the games. Now, he doesn't have any way to necessarily avoid damage. You can argue protect because it's block half. If you very rarely get double protect, you can block all, but the instance that you get double protect is incredibly rare. But his sense of mitigating damage, accuracy, and crit make for a very deadly combination to guarantee yourself undefendable damage, which is always a great thing depending on the hero matchup. Some heroes' defenses are devastating. His unique cards, I would argue, are probably some of the strongest out of any of the heroes in the game. His upgrades, I really do like the Retaliate upgrade. That particular upgrade unlocks a secondary ability on his board, which is a great fallback on because it gives you Retribution. I'm trying to remember the name of the freaking ability. It's slipping my mind. Somebody will remind me. But his upgrades are strong. Now, Tithe is a unique ability as well with the passive. You can upgrade it, put it into play. Generally, I don't see too much usage for it. Unless you're getting an early game. But with Paladin in particular, again, it's all about blocking damage. Retribution is a really strong token, hitting back. One thing I do think that is fun to mention, of course, Paladin games take a while. So if you're playing a tournament game or if you're playing against a Paladin, just bear in mind that the 30 minutes on the box might not necessarily be accurate even for a competitive fast tournament player. Paladin will slow the game down and control it in a way that you have to be prepared for. And because he is a character that can heal, which not too many can, he does have the ability to stall out specific heroes. Now, that's not something he would want to be doing against somebody like Loki or Shadow Thief necessarily, or Black Widow, for instance. But Paladin I find to be a very strong, consistent character against most of the cast, provided you're patient. Now, he is one of the most punishing characters for those that love using their third roll. When it comes to Paladin, I highly advise just take whatever you get on the second roll and use your first roll to base off that, right? That's just common basic strategy for Paladin, but he is a very easy character to whiff with, and you kind of get into that gambling mindset where you're like, I'm going to tithe, I'm going to tithe, I'm going to tithe, and you keep rerolling, and you're like, damn, I'm out of CP now. Anyway, moving on to Black Widow. People were laughing at me because I did put her in S tier originally. I do now disagree with that, and I put her in high A tier. I still considered her to be very strong. What's cool about her? So she can play upgrades at any time. Awesome, right? Well, she can siphon through her deck pretty well. She has pretty decent card draw and combat point generation through a few abilities, few unique cards. Agility, I find, is a really good token. Block half damage. She can stack that twice, just like Protect, but she actually gets it a lot easier than Paladin does. And of course, she likes the game to be going on for a while because the more upgrades she gets in play, the better. Time Bomb I find to be a very consistent token as well. The ability to do 4 damage, you just flip it and you just pound the opponent really hard. Overall, her damage is higher than average. Her build-up is pretty strong, pretty consistent. I would say Widow is not my favorite hero to play, but definitely one of the heroes that you need to be aware of that will come into tournament play. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. We have Thor. Again, we're going to be talking post-nerf Thor. So for those that are unfamiliar, basically we just changed with the leaflet. So we no longer guard break on 1, 2, 3. I believe we guard break on 4 to 5. And electrokinesis is now main phase, right? And it takes 4 rather than 3. So with those two changes in mind, basically the overall issue with Thor was that his board was overtuned. Similarly, when we look back to Pyro, you have an insane defense. You have super easy roll objectives with some of the highest damage outputting base abilities on the board. So, but of course, when you do a character change, you can't change anything on the board. You have to change the leaflet. So they kind of nerfed his tokens to the ground. But in exchange for that, you instead have a character that still has, again, one of the strongest base abilities. He still can draw cards more consistently than the average character. He has cards, unique cards that are incredibly powerful, some that I would argue should not even be in the deck. But overall, Thor is just a massive powerhouse. Now, pre-nerf, he was 75% win rate, top of the meta, undisputed. Like, everybody would be banning him. Like, nobody would even let you play the character. That's how absurd he was. Now, a newer player might pick up Thor pre-nerf and be like, oh, I didn't really think he was that good. Well, that, of course, comes down to how you pilot the character. There was literally no downside to Thor. Now, with the nerf, he has a pretty lower, I would say, He has a much less push in the economy aspect, but is still devastating in terms of the damage he outputs and the damage mitigation he can create. He has a little bit of healing, but it's not really too oppressive. But overall, I just dislike characters that can block 2 damage per symbol with defense. But that personal bias aside, of course, Thor is a monster, post or pre. I still think that, I mean, maybe after the nerf, there's not a whole ton of data on him post nerf, but you could probably argue he's bottom of A tier, but I would never put him in B or C. Moving on to Spider-Man Morales. So or excuse me, pre-buff, Spider-Man was at the bottom. I would argue probably the weakest character in the game, if not one of the weakest characters in the game. So if you guys are playing without that leaflet patch changes, combo got made to be unique, so that can't be transferred anymore. Webs works immediately, no longer requiring a turn of cooldown, and does 2 isolated damage immediately. And those 2 changes kind of just pushed Morales to be one of the strongest characters in the game. Which sounds kind of weird on paper, but the overall strategy with the hero is you get a combo, you inflict a web to do undefendable, and then you do another attack. His objectives are also pretty easy to roll. I mean, he does have 2 defenses, but yeah, the amount of damage this character can offset. If you end up facing a character with a weaker defense, you're absolutely going to crush it by just spamming combos. If you're able to bypass defense, of course, with webs, small, large, straight, which is pretty consistent, pretty easy to hit for the character. Again, you're just going to be outputting so much damage that your opponent's not going to know how to respond. So overall, with the buffs in mind, I put Spider-Man in high A. Moving on to Artificer, I'm not a huge fan of Artificer. Like, I love the character, love the theme, love the generation of the actual hero, but he's not my preferred playstyle just because he is kind of engine-based, economy built, but not in the sense that I like. A lot of people love him just because he's build up, but the reason he's strong is just, again, another jack of all trades characters. He can heal, he can do isolated damage, he can attack mod, his abilities are pretty consistent. Schematics is a fun ability that lets you draw cards. I think, again, Artificer, one of the reasons people like him is just a bit of it's not like a ton of control, but the way that you can pilot the hero, you have a little bit more options. You're not necessarily tied down to one baseline strategy. You can go for a more healing defensive approach, or you can alternate it to a very aggressive approach, which is not a strategy a lot of heroes can do. But depending on the Artificer pilot, I would say that's something that is definitely to be considered. Like, if you're facing Artificer and you don't really know like what to do, what to respond, you can get turtled up on against and really get blown back to back by ults or by card generation or even Shockbot alone amplifying damage. It's absolutely devastating depending on the matchup. Moving on to B tier here. Let's talk about Vampire Lord. So another character that got buffed. Vampire Lord I find to be one of the strongest heroes after the buff in the B tier. Glamour spam, man. I gotta tell you, undefendable is super easy objective to roll. The blood power changes just make her absolutely devastating. Of course, she does have one of the weakest defenses in the game. I mean, you could put her in a glass cannon category, which she kind of is, but the difference between her and Pyromancer is she actually has the ability to do a health swing of upwards of 10 plus, depending on the card draw, the combination that you get. Like, let's say you do an ultimate, you add that blood power, you get 4 blood power to do the healing effect. The fact that she can now draw cards for a cheaper cost with blood power, and the changes that were made to give her an additional blood power when the opponent has bleeds inflicted on them. Overall, very strong, consistent hero. I love her to bits. I think, of course, without the buff, she was in a bit of a weaker position just board-wise, but kind of opposite problem to Thor, where she still has a weaker than average board, I would argue, but with the token changes, it kind of just amplifies her style quite a bit. Couple of fun matchups. I like Vampire into Paladin. I think that one's pretty cool. You can just consistently hit with undefendable. The ability, again, to just add that blood power, add the blood power, add the blood power. You're just hitting things really hard, really strong. Another character that can heal. I think healing characters in general are pretty strong. But yeah, not too much else to be said about Vamp. Looking at Loki, I, again, put him at top B. People argue because he can be like a niche character. I like Loki because I feel like he plays relatively decent into characters like Monk. I think he plays exceptionally well into characters like Artificer. I would even argue that he hard counters Paladin, to give you a more extreme example. But I love Loki, and a little bit of bias there, of course, showing at top of B. I would say on average, more tournament players would put him at bottom of B. But Spellbound, man. Spellbound, you lock up those abilities. Illusion, very consistent. The effect that you can do Undefendable quite easily when you alternate between Vilify and, of course, your Bag of Tricks. The unique cards that you possess, I just find the character to be very annoying to play against and very fun to play as. Out of the tournament games I've played as Loki, my health differential has never been higher. I've won many games on 30 to 40 differential, just because you consistently hit illusions. You know how to mitigate the damage. You play into his card combos. But I find Loki to be a very fun character, very strong character in the tournament meta. So just something to be considered of for sure. Moving on to Ninja. Some people might place Ninja at the lower end of B. I find that she's very consistent in the fact that she does Undefendable quite easily, not necessarily on the base board, but with Ninjutsu, with her tokens. Smokescreen I find to be a very fun ability to go for. The ability to dodge damage on a 50-50 with cards like Try Again, you can re-roll your defense as well. Get that smoke bomb, play that smoke bomb, smoke offering. She has a lot of different ways to avoid damage with smoke. Ninjutsu, of course, being fun, but she also, in my opinion, has one of the best small straights with the upgrade, the ability to inflict multiple delayed poisons back to back. And what's awesome about delayed poison is that it's damage that's inflicted when the person passes. So it's kind of something that is kind of like an immediate trigger response during their first main phase. They're like, oh, do I want to remove this token? Because Ninja doesn't give delayed poison on defense or outside of roll phase traditionally. So it kind of like puts a decision in the opponent's mind like, hey, I'm about to take this damage. Do I want to output my resources to getting rid of these tokens? So of course she is victim to what status effects after a smoke screen is played. But you know that's just kind of traditional with most characters that way. But Ninjutsu I find to be a very fun token. She can hit for very consistent damage. Role objectives are incredibly easy. If I were to make a comparison for her to another hero, we'd probably, I mean, it's hard to say, but you can always use the example of Pyromancer. I don't think it's the best one, but you remove the glass cannon aspect for a very strong survivability token. Actually, you know what? I'd probably put her more comparatively, excuse me. I mean, you could make arguments between her, Spider-Man, but yeah, she doesn't really have a turtle play style. You just get tokens, you attack, you attack, you attack. Very consistent, undefendable. Strong hero overall. That's why I put her in B. Huntress. I failed tremendously at piloting Huntress. Probably the worst Huntress player out there, or one of. With the buff, definitely helped her quite a bit in terms of her survivability. I think she has a place in the competitive meta that's a little bit unexplored, underappreciated. She also can do pretty decent undefendable damage, but with the way that she pilots Nira, bleeds being outputted. Unfortunately, the issue that I find with her is her cards are too expensive. Her board is kind of like structured in a very difficult way. But patience rewards, right? So this is one of those heroes that I would argue actually fares very well against something like Curse Pirate, which is not really something you can say with any of the other characters, because she is designed to be that stall-based hero without that economy aspect, without that punishing aspect because of Nira. So for those that are interested in learning the hero, just bear in mind that I would actually argue that the Huntress is probably the hardest character out of the entire Dice Throne roster to learn and master. But with that, of course, patience comes reward. So very strong, consistent hero if played in the right hands. I have not met very many strong pilots with her, but the few that I have met have had very incredible success. So moving on to Treant. Treant I put at bottom of B. It's like a, I hate to say it because I love the Treant as an actual character, but he feels almost like a budget monk. You're kind of replacing Evasive with a little bit of healing factor. His damage overall is lower. Now, what makes Treant unique is your flexibility. You can do card draws, you can do combat points, you can do re-rolls, you can do health generation. Again, the issue I feel like with Treant is he's just trying to do too much. And with that, you would generally in a competitive tournament or competitive environment prefer a character that masters one or two specific aspects. But with Treant, I don't think he's a bad hero at all. His role objectives are fine, not the easiest, not the hardest. But I find that getting into that combo or getting into that rhythm, depending on the hero you're playing against, you can just be outmatched in specific examples. But what puts him in B, to speak on his strength, not to dog on the character completely, is the fact that he can play in a multitude of ways. Like going back to the discussion we had on Artificer, um, I would find that Artificer, Monk, and Treant are probably some of the only characters on this list. I mean, there might be a couple more that I'm forgetting. These are the three main heroes that you would consider falling under a specific, like, turtling, more defensive style that can still alternate and switch over to an offensive style. Tokens like Barb Vine, the ability that Wellspring, you can kind of play around it to either do healing or undefendable, is nice because depending on the matchup, Treant really does not want to be swinging too hard. A downside to Treant's defense, of course, he doesn't hit back at all. But the reason I put him in B again, I feel like he has a lot of abilities to, he has the ability to do a lot of things. But as far as what you do with those tokens or with those particular actions are very specific matchups, matchup dependent, and then you find yourself being outclassed in certain situations. Moving on to Moon Elf, I put her in B. Some people put her top of C, but I find Moon Elf to be one of my favorite heroes. Main two issues that I have with her: if you get a bad starting hand, you don't get any cards or economy outside of income phase, and a lot of her cards are very expensive. Secondarily, her board is very punishing. She requires a lot of sixes. Now, the strength of the hero, she has in what I believe to be one of the strongest defenses in the game. Roll 5, block half damage on a 4 or 5, I believe, is roughly 40% odds. So you're going into a defensive roll with almost a 50-50 to dodge half of whatever the opponent is throwing at you, which I find to be incredibly awesome. One of her strengths, of course, is the tokens that she dishes out. So if you, again, one of those heroes you have to be patient with in the way that you pilot. Because if you don't have the cards backed up to combat points, or you see your opponent is backed up and you just don't expect it, you can get punished very easily by whiffs. This is one of the characters that you whiff the most with, comparatively to someone like Treant, who has seedlings to reroll, has much easier time chasing objectives. Moon Elf is similar to Huntress in the way that she can get punished quite easily. Inflicting targeted, of course, being your top priority, but with tokens like Blind, Evasive, and Tangle, she's just such a hard target to hit. If you can get those tokens consistently, I find her to be one of the strongest characters in the game. But again, I find that if you get a low or bad card draw to start the game, that can offset you a tremendous amount compared to the rest of the cast. Moving on to Scarlet Witch, I put her at top of C. I personally would actually, I favor her more, but that's bias speaking. I think C, top of C, is actually where she should be placed. On paper, you can argue she's a budget pyromancer. It kind of feels that way, unfortunately, as much as the fact that I would actually probably say that she's my second favorite hero aside from Tactician. What she tries to do is an incredible amount of damage, probably one of the highest damage dealers in the game, offsetting with Crackle. Of course, I love the fact that Conjure, you can use that to take tokens. Probability manipulation, the fact that she can manipulate dice as a glass cannon hero is amazing. She also has the most cards that allow you to modify dice out of, I believe, any of the other heroes, plus the shared cards that are in every hero's deck. So I just love that control aspect. We haven't even talked about Reality Warp, one of the most frustrating tokens to play against. The only token, I believe, in the base set, not including DTA, that doesn't even allow you to roll for an ultimate. So like you get a Reality Warp on you, guess what? You don't have one of your dice. So you're either rolling a straight or you're rolling something with 4 tokens, or you're not rolling anything at all. So playing against which people can find to be incredibly frustrating. I love the matchup against specific heroes. Now, I think she gets dunked on by characters like Pyromancer, Monk, but she plays perfectly, I think, into characters like Paladin. I would even argue she has a pretty consistent matchup into Shadow Thief. Some people might laugh at me for saying that, but I believe if you can inflict Reality Warp on Shadow Thief and conjure those shadows, that this is actually not a terrible matchup. Probably not the best, but I would not mind going into that. Characters like Artificer, you put Scarlet Witch against somebody like Huntress or Moon Elf, and I'm telling you, you're going to have a pretty good time. Now, as far as the drawbacks to her, similarly to Moon Elf, she does not really generate cards or combat points. So if you get a bad hand, she has a lot of upgrades, a lot of unique cards that she can get stuck with. Her defense, and of course, actually, she has no way to mitigate damage at all. So she doesn't even have smoke like the ninja does. She's I believe she has one unique card in her deck that can lower a couple damage taken, like a shield. I think it's called Hex Shield, actually, now that I'm reflecting on that. But again, I find her to be fun just for that control aspect. Tactician, my favorite hero. I could probably talk about Tactician for an hour, but I won't because this video is already getting long. People consider Tactician to be one of the worst characters, even after the buff. I don't necessarily disagree that he is bad, but I do definitely disagree with that he is one of the worst heroes. So, main issue with Tactician is his base board is incredibly low value. And I would actually argue his base board is probably the weakest amongst the entire Dice Throne cast. Carpet Bomb is the weakest ability in the entire game. And I would actually argue even weaker than any upgraded ability. Like, you know, those abilities you get as a secondary ability? I think Carpet Bomb shouldn't even been designed. Like, give him something like schematics like Artificer where he gets tactical and draws cards. That would have been way more thematic to the hero, in my opinion. But anyway, Carpet Bomb is dog. Base attack is not that good. I'm dogging on the hero because he's my favorite, so you're going to hear a lot of positive things in a second. Small Straight is consistent, but it's weak damage. Profiteer is another complete dog ability. Like, you really don't want to be chasing it. So what is the strength of the character, right? I've listed a lot of penalties. Oh, not to mention also he has a ton of upgrades in his deck. All of his cards are way too expensive, even though he generates combat points. Okay, enough negativity. Positivity. Tactician I find to be awesome. He probably hits ults one of the most consistently out of the cast if you're excluding the name brand Shadow Thief and Cursed Pirate in the top. Rerolling is awesome. Targeted is probably one of my favorite status effects, just the ability to do +2. It brings his damage up to the rest of the cast, but without targeted, of course, you're well below average. Protect. You can do double protect far more consistently than Paladin can. Guess what? You have 4 tactical advantage and a protect. You're dodging everything. It is a little bit more predictable in the sense because you do see the tactical advantage on the board, but guess what? You can also use that to draw cards, get combat points, reroll. Constrict. And might I tell you, the changes to Constrict with the buff, incredible. The fact that the opponent cannot go for a second or third roll without paying a combat point, some characters can do that no problem. I would say half of the characters in B, A, and S really don't like giving up a CP or 2 every turn. So if you're able to consistently hit Constrict, you're in a very significant advantage in terms of board state. What I will say, as somebody who's played hundreds of games on Tactician, probably the most, if not one of the most out of anybody that's not official or a playtester, you need an ultimate to win a game. It is very rare that you win a game as Tactician without either a lot of large straights or at least one ultimate. Now you might be asking, well, ultimates are hard to hit, you know, like, what do you mean you have to get an ultimate to win with this character? Well, the whole concept is you're kind of like slowly building a base engine, and kind of like when you get the 6s handed to you with the dice, that's when you chase it when you have the cards and combat points to back it up. So using Constrict to kind of whittle your opponent's resources away, absorbing whatever hits they do with Protect, and finding the right opportune moment to chase that ultimate. That's what separates a Tactician is trash from somebody that's like myself, that I consider to be a decent Tactician player, is knowing when to chase the 6s. Because you do have, geez, I can't believe I don't remember this ability. I should have everything memorized on Tactician. You do have Strategic Approach, and with Strategic Approach, you can still give Constrict. With upgrades with cards, you can give Constrict, but your base strategy, keep giving them Constrict, because the more you limit your opponent's ability to actually do an ability or like pay combat points, that reveals a ton of information to when you should be chasing that ult. So I said a lot of negative things on Tac, but Tac's my favorite. I have to give it to him. So moving over to Black Panther. Panther actually plays quite similarly to Tactician. You take a beating, you have a shield, of course, kinetic energy, you absorb, you burst. What separates the two, I find that Panther's incredibly easier to pilot, less punishing. Defense is weaker, damage mitigation overall is weaker, but the damage you output is significantly higher. He doesn't draw as many cards or as many combat points because he only gets burst, which generally happens like once or twice a game. It's not too common you get 3 bursts off as Panther, or at least from I believe that's a correct statement. I think the average is 2 bursts per game with Panther. Maybe I'm wrong. Somebody can correct me if I'm being stupid. But the damage he outputs is pretty consistent. It's not the strongest amongst the cast. Why he's low in C tier. He just doesn't master at anything. To give you a more like extreme example, I would even argue like you kind of took what makes Monk very special and very significant, and you kind of just limit that to a very baseline degree with Panther. There's nothing that Panther can do that Monk doesn't do better. Like even if you argue in the economy sense that he has a couple of ways to get cards and combat points, the damage mitigation is just not there, right? With the Vibranium, he blocks 3 damage. You get the card combo that you want, you get 6 damage. Now, Panther's still in my top 5 favorite characters out of the entire cast, don't get me wrong. Baseline ability is very easy to roll for. I love that for him. But yeah, I find that if you were to put him against the higher characters, more commonly than not, you'll be facing defeat. Moving on to Strange. A lot of people like him higher. I don't. I haven't seen him had any success in any tournament. I find his objectives to be very hard to roll for. The fact that he doesn't have any upgrade cards, but they're instead replaced with spells. Spells can be very punishing. I'll have to be honest with you. If you don't get the card draw that you need, if you don't draw them at all, the character, he really doesn't generate anything on the card or combat point front. And with the objectives being very hard to chase, very hard to roll, it can put you in kind of a difficult situation. Crimson Bands is, of course, a cool token. Deja Vu is a fun concept to reroll, which kind of plays off his weakness of not being able to go for abilities as easy as most of the cast. Now, the reason I don't put him lower is because if you are able to get into a combination of cards, the abilities that he can pull off are far higher and far consistent. Or consistent's the wrong word, sorry. If you manage to pull into those card combinations, the combos that you can deal are far more powerful than your baseline hero in terms of what damage output, in terms of what you can produce. But if you don't draw into those cards, then you're going to be struggling a lot in terms of what you can do as the character. Moving on to Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel outputs a ton of damage, but she doesn't have any way to block or mitigate damage. Her defense is one of the weakest amongst the cast. Now, what her strength is of course Cosmic Ray. Cosmic Ray is a very strong token. If you gave Cosmic Ray to anything on BA or S, they would be way stronger, way more broken. But that's kind of her bread and butter. This character I would actually identify as a budget poor man's Pyromancer, in the sense that anything that Captain Marvel does, Pyromancer just does better. Easier objectives with Pyromancer. Captain Marvel can output damage, but it's not as high as some of the things on this list, but that's the reason she's placed lower. Samurai, baseline for balance. You can definitely win games with Samurai against some of the higher characters, but if you're losing more games than you're winning against a Samurai, kind of have to evaluate your playstyle a little bit more. But Samurai, basic output damage character, nothing too particularly special to say about him. His playstyle is very simplistic. You go for your second roll, you gain honor, you spam small straights, you do 11 damage with the upgrade, I believe, or it's like 10 damage. You can output consistent anywhere between 7 to 10 damage as Samurai if you're patient with rolling. But it's just not enough. He doesn't have enough mitigation. There's no economy for the hero. There's really no way to outplay certain heroes that are being piloted perfectly. Moving on to bottom here with D tier, Santa. I mean, I love the holiday characters, but they're in the D tier for a reason. Eggnog is just not enough to push Santa high. He has the same baseline abilities as Barbarian. I don't really think I need to talk too much about him. I mean, the fact that he can also kind of get a stun off is cool. The reason why he's put higher than Barbarian, despite them being very similar, is he trades a bit of damage for much more economy. So that alone is what stands him out from Barbarian. You get cards, you get combat points a little bit easier. But yeah, don't think I need to clarify too much on Santa. Krampus, I love the concept of the hero. Really good with the ability to draw cards, right? You're getting out the rejects. You're outputting gifts. But again, where he kind of falls flat is like Doctor Strange, where you need to get a specific combination to succeed. And outside of that, you have baseline abilities that are not the easiest to roll for, can be incredibly punishing. So that's just kind of where I set him as. Gunslinger. So I have to put Gunslinger in D, even though I don't like it, because she is very heat or very Sahara Desert, but not in a good way, like dying of dehydration. Like, you can go very hot or you can go very cold, is what I'm trying to say. She lives or dies by the dice. You have evasive, you have reloads. Everything she does is based on roll value. Defense with your opponent, small straight. She either smokes the opponent or she doesn't. I find an issue that's the biggest glaring issue with her. She does not gain cards, but she gains too much CP because bounty generates her that combat point value, but she doesn't really have too much to spend it on. So that this character, I love them to death, don't get me wrong, but the ride or die concept you have to consider, and the reason why she's in D is when you take her to a tournament, you really don't want to base your game on what I consider to be the most luck-dependent character out of the entire cast. Seraph. Unfortunately, Seraph is the weakest character in Dice Throne overall, but the reason she's a nick above Barbarian is just because of the flexibility, right? You have things like Flight, you can use that offensively, defensively. Cleanse allows you to play a little bit off mitigation. It's just her base ability is just so weak compared to the rest of the cast. Her tokens is really what kind of salvages her in the D tier and not like absolutely lower. There's a lot of Seraph lovers, but unfortunately I can't agree with you. Her cards are just way too expensive for what they are. I think she has several cards that are 3 and 4 CP, and she doesn't even generate CP in any way. Her objectives are not even the easiest to chase, but her abilities are also very hard to roll into. So I find Seraph to just be a weak character overall. I can't really uptalk her too much because, again, like Flight, which is probably her biggest strength, is kind of essentially just a budget evasive. Characters, again, like Moon, I would even argue Moon Elf is a direct upgrade to Seraph in almost every way. I'm probably going to get a mean comment about that one. But yeah, I can't get behind Seraph. I like the concept art. I love the actual character itself, but you're never going to see a Seraph brought to a serious competitive tournament. And if you are, I would be very surprised to see her win more than maybe 30-something% of her games if you're playing against an experienced opponent. Last here, moving on to the Barbarian. The reason he's in bottom is, unfortunately, he is live or die by rolling sixes. He doesn't produce any economy. Everybody that's played Dice Throne has probably heard or seen Barbarian or played against Barbarian. If you hit sixes, he's awesome. If you don't, he's one of the worst characters. Like, you need to hit large straight consistently. His max damage output without stun, though, is 15. You get 5 recoil, so you're looking at 9 to 10, if that at best. Which every character in B or higher does more than that, and majority of the characters in C do more than that consistently. So unfortunately, that's where Barbarian kind of sits. The reason why, you know, he actually can win certain matchups is his healing factor with defense. You really don't want to be going for Fortitude as an offensive ability in 1v1. But yeah, Barbarian is unfortunately just that character that is introduced to players on how to play the game. And just what he outputs in return is just not very rewarding in a tournament aspect. By the way, I played in a randomizer tournament where I made semifinals against one of the strongest Dice Throne players. He got pre-nerf Thor, and I got Barbarian. And I didn't win that game. Yeah, so you just got randomly assigned one hero, and that's just the matchup I got. But I had to throw that in there as well, just because I'm still a little bit salty. Whereas the X-Men heroes will place, I have not spoiled myself on anything, so that's going to come with a couple hundred games of experience in a few months. So this video was longer than I expected it to be. I know I talked probably a lot longer about the top of the list than the bottom, but let me know if you guys agree, disagree. Again, I think you can slide a couple heroes to the left or to the right, but I believe that this tier list is going to be just pretty consistent on what to expect in the current competitive tournament meta. But if you guys enjoyed, do let me know, and I'll hope to see you guys in a future video. Take care.